Hello everyone, welcome to MJ Hobby Corner. MJ here, and in this video we're going to put the rule book 1 Hour War Games on the spotlight. So for those of you that don't know what MJ Gaming Spotlight is, it's just a very informal video. I basically pull out a rule set from my collection and talk about it, go over it, talk about the mechanics a little bit. If I've done any demo playing with the game, then we'll show clips of the game itself. What kind of miniatures, if it's miniature agnostic, what kind of miniatures do I use? What kind of terrain do I use? Those kind of things that'll help the newer player decide if this this is something interesting or not, and also give games a little bit of exposure, especially older games or games that are not very popular. Those may make it into my gaming spotlight if there's something about them that I really like. Okay, so that's for anyone that's new to the channel. That's what these MJ Gaming Spotlights do, and I'm changing their format and kind of adding new things to it, hopefully keeping it short. So that is today's MJ Gaming Spotlight. Let's get right to it. Did a couple of test games for this, and it was very, very interesting. So I'm gonna have another video where I report on that separately, but for today I want to go over the 1 Hour War Games rules. So 1 Hour War Games is written by author Neil Thomas. It is primarily a rule set for historical wargaming, but I'm sure it can be tweaked, and I know that people have done it in the past. They have tweaked to play the rules in fantasy and even in sci-fi. That's something I'll talk about a little bit later in the video, but we'll reserve most of that for another video that I have coming that's going to talk specifically about using these rules in fantasy or sci-fi. So the book is about 214 pages. There are 22 chapters in the book. 18 chapters are dedicated to the different time periods that a player can choose to play in. For example, everything from ancients all the way up to World War II. So there's different time periods in between. You have Dark Ages, you have the medieval periods, you have pike and shot, you have horse and saber period, all these different periods in between. So there are 9 periods that it provides, and then 9 descriptions for each of those periods. So the author chose a very interesting way of organizing the book. And by the way, it is a very organized book. It's the way it's written, it's well written, all these things. It's easy to follow. It's not difficult to understand. But so an interesting thing that the author did is he would have a historic period which would outline the rules for that historic period, the game rules. But before that, the chapter before that, there will be a section that describes the historical significance of that time period and how those battles were fought and just historical notes on what was going on. So if he has his medieval section, there will be a variant of the game rules that will allow you to play war games in a medieval setting. But then prior to that, there is a description of the medieval historic period and how things were fought, which weapons were critical, the role of cavalry, the role of infantry, that kind of thing, from a very historic sense. I thought that was very interesting, very informative. I liked the way it wasn't overbearing, right? It was just enough historical information that made it interesting. So, at least in my opinion, not too bad. So the game is designed, and this is another interesting thing, for 1/72 ratio scale. Okay. However, the author does state that you can play the game in any scale, and I certainly believe that. If you modify your board a little bit, the size, you could definitely play with 28 millimeter. You can play with 1/72 scale, the way the author has written the rules for, or 15 millimeters, or maybe even smaller. I tried mostly 15 millimeter and 1/72 scale. I'm sure it would play fine in any of the larger scales. Games could be resolved in about an hour. One of the games I had was resolved in about 45 minutes, sometimes a little less, sometimes a little more, depending on how many units you have and all that. So it does live up to its 1 hour war game thing, and that's why the rules are so basically so simplified. So the book recommends in the sort of the general, he does have a section in the beginning where he just talks about sort of the general things that you need for wargaming in these different periods. He recommends 3 feet by 3 feet as a board size. I played with 2.5 feet by 2 feet roughly, and even though it was a little bit skewed that way, it still worked out for me. I played with 15mm scale. Um, so, unit types. The way this book deals with units and the way units fight is what makes this rule set so different, so unique. I will admit that at first, when I first glanced over the rules, I didn't really think I would like it. I really didn't. I thought it was maybe too simplified. One of the things is that you will not be rolling defense for your units. Basically, it's the attacking unit that does all the hits. Okay, we'll get to that in just a minute. It felt very strange at first. Okay, so unit types are mentioned in the scenarios, and it's the scenarios that dictate kind of the unit types that are going to be fighting. Now, there are 30 different scenarios. It's a lot of scenarios. In fact, most of the book is scenarios. Okay, so the core mechanic is very simple. The core mechanic to the game, you have attacker and defender. Basically, a unit has can accumulate 15 hits. After 15 hits, it is eliminated. Okay, so acquisition of 15 hits for unit elimination, that is the core mechanic. And then there are 9 different variants to this mechanic that kind of change how you take your wounds, right, and how many wounds a unit gets. And so that those 9 variants are what gives you the flavor for the different periods. Speaking of period variations, this is the table used in the World War II time period, and basically these are modifiers given to the shooting unit against the defending unit. The shooting unit's the only one doing the rolls. This is also further modified by any cover provided by the terrain for the defending unit. So that was something that I was really interested in is, well, with a core mechanic that is played out throughout all the games, how will the time periods really feel different? So if I played in the ancient, sort of a war game set in the ancient time period, would it feel different from, say, the Dark Ages or the pike and shot, you know, or saber and horse that it has? That was one of the time periods it has here. Or World War II, because it goes up from ancient history all the way up to World War II. So it covers a lot of different time periods. Remember, this is all historical now. Terrain also modifies, especially in the later periods, it seems, modifies how units get wounds and things like that. So basically maneuvering your vulnerable units into terrain really helps out. So let's look at how terrain influences the different periods. So here we have the rifle and saber period. If you go all the way to the top, you notice that woods can only be entered by skirmishers. And in the American Civil Wars period, only infantry and zouaves may enter. Zouaves or zouve are elite troops. I just learned that term. It's a generic term for elite troops. So, also important is that flanks and rear attacks do affect how much damage a unit gets. So army composition is determined randomly in this rule set, and basically I had to roll on a little table because I wanted to demo with 4 units, and my result was a 1, so that meant that I can add 2 infantry units, an archer unit, and then 0 skirmishers, levies, or swordsmen, or elites, and then 1 cavalry unit. And this will also be modified by the period you're working in. So obviously this table includes all the periods. You can see, for example, the very last column is cavalry, men-at-arms, and tanks. So everything is lumped into one simple little table, and this provides some uncertainty to the kinds of troops that you're going to get. So this is an example army with that table, and I'm using fantasy figures. You have some archers here. There's a unit of infantry, lizardmen infantry, and then a unit of dwarf infantry, and that covers my 2 infantry units, my archer unit, and a single cavalry unit. All right. So yeah, it's an interesting way of players, instead of choosing units, you kind of roll on this random table, and that represents that generals, they have to work with whatever they get, not necessarily the units they want. So for the orcs, I rolled a 6, and so this is their army composition: 3 infantry and 1 cavalry. Okay, so very interesting how the armies just are very different because it's a random method. Now I use the pitched scenario, which is the easiest, and also the medieval time period. Also, cards, since this was a solo game, the chance cards, I wanted to try them out. And every beginning of the turn, 1 card was drawn, and then the effects applied. The number of the card coincides with the table. And as I said, this was the medieval time period. So I played a few turns, a whole game actually. But by the second turn, the orc cavalry had reached the dwarf rams. That's what I was using as my cavalry. And it's very interesting because there are no like charge bonuses or anything like that. It's very straightforward. Roll 1 die, see how many hits. These are modified according to certain conditions, and then you apply that to the enemy. So it is a very attrition combat. It's a fight to the death. There's no morale basically once units are in combat. So the combat lasted about 4 turns, and that was what I was curious about. On average, how long did these combats take? And you can see there by the dice that I added the different damages, hits that each unit took. Again, the chance events were a big influence. On one of the turns, my archer units had limited ammunition, and so they had to stop firing for a while until they got themselves, some more ammunition or whatever it is. And that really affected my shooting. But here, this was around turn 5 or 6. The archers got into a position. These are lizardmen archers, and fired upon the approaching orc infantry, and did a few hits. So that shooting units are going to help very much in this time period, really very much. So the orcs were already had taken a few hits from the archers, and the only thing that I was doing for the AI is that the opponent models would attack any of my closest models. They would either rush towards them or attack the closest models. But the orcs were already wounded, so the lizardman infantry, and I was trying to attack them by the flanks. The lizardman infantry was victorious, and that combat lasted about 3 turns. So by 3 turns, the orcs were destroyed. So really, most of the combats lasted anywhere from 3 up to 5 turns, in my little demos. So
And then the last remaining units on the 8th turn were the goblin units. And I rarely play games this long. And of course, in a pitched battle, whoever kills the most is the victor, and the lizardmen had wiped out nearly all the orcs except for the goblins, so the alliance between dwarves and lizardmen was victorious. So I learned a few things about this.
Okay, so that was my little demo. I just showed a couple of turns, a couple of the highlights for those turns. I played 8 turns the first game, did a couple of demo turns after that by tweaking a few of the rules to see what happens. And then I also played a couple of turns of the World War II time period, and that was very different. It felt very different. I will report on that in another video. But one of the things that's very important in this game is if you get your units to attack the flanks and the rear of your opponent, that will be devastating to the opponent because you double your rolls. And as long as you're rolling okay, like I rolled a 4 one time, it was a flank attack, and then double that. That means 8 hits right there, right off the bat, plus any modifications that the time period gives you or whatever, or cover. All those things influence. I was able to do a good amount of damage, to the unit. So flank attacks and rear attacks are very important in this game. Otherwise, it's going to be very slow combat. The cards had a dramatic effect because, and they are drawn every turn. And so one for the opponent, one for yourself. They do have a dramatic effect on how the turn goes because some units, there's just chance events that happen. Some units won't be able to activate, or some units take a hit because they just did something that while they were moving or whatever. And so yeah, it really influences the game a lot. So the only thing is that the AI, there's no AI. The author doesn't really give you an AI. So I had to just do a very simple kind of AI to make sure that the opponent moves towards me, and that certain conditions so that the opponent gets to attack me and all that, because of course this was solo. So the solo, not a lot of the author gives you some advice on solo wargaming and all that, but not a lot in terms of a real mechanic for solo. I'm going to be doing a lot of experimentation with these roles. I also tried messing a bit with that whole 15 acquisition, and some units had less, and other units had the 15 acquisition, and that also made a big effect as some units died quicker. So definitely a very interesting war game set. Rule set. Would I recommend it? Yeah, of course, I would recommend it if you're the kind of person that likes historical war games, or if you want to use it in fantasy and kind of tweak it. Remember that this is a rule set designed for fast play. This is very, very streamlined and designed for fast play, but it has a few merits to it, quite a few merits, and it's a very interesting system. So I'm going to be tweaking it a bit, and we'll come back some other time in the future and look at some fantasy games, maybe a real battle report using this rule set. All right. And of course, anything I modify, I will make sure I say it. So, folks, thank you very much. This is the end of MJ Gaming Spotlight. I hope this wasn't too long, and I hope that you found it interesting. See you in the next MJ Gaming Spotlight as we review another rule set from my library. Have a great one, folks.